The biggest twist in Silo Season 3, Episode 4 wasn't that Bernard appeared alive. It was the way the episode quietly challenged everything we thought we knew about his fate. The writers didn't just bring him back for shock value. They scattered clues throughout the episode, and even across previous seasons, that suggest Bernard's survival may have been part of a much larger plan. And if that's true, then we're looking at one of the most carefully constructed mysteries this series has ever attempted. Think about it. Ever since the rebellion reached its breaking point, Bernard has always been portrayed as the man who sees 5 moves ahead of everyone else. Even when his decisions were ruthless, they were rarely impulsive. He understood the system better than anyone, knew how information shaped power, and constantly reminded us that survival inside the silo wasn't about strength, it was about control. So when the audience believed he had died, something never quite felt right. The show spent years building Bernard into the mastermind behind Silo 18, only to seemingly erase him in a single moment. For a series that hides clues in plain sight, that felt almost too simple. The first piece of evidence is surprisingly subtle. When Bernard finally appears, the camera doesn't treat his return like a miracle. It doesn't linger on emotional reactions or spend time explaining how he escaped. Instead, the scene moves with confidence, almost as if the writers expect us to understand that there is more happening beneath the surface. That's a storytelling technique Silo has used before. Whenever the show avoids answering an obvious question, it's usually because the answer is connected to a bigger revelation still waiting to unfold. The mystery isn't simply, how did Bernard survive? The real question is, why did the show wait until now to reveal that he did? That timing matters. If Bernard had returned immediately after his apparent death, the surprise would have been temporary. But by allowing viewers to accept his death first, the writers transformed his return into something much more dangerous. Now every conversation, every decision made in his absence, suddenly deserves a second look. Who knew he was alive? Who was deliberately spreading the belief that he was dead? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was Bernard ever actually out of control? This leads directly into our second piece of evidence, and it might be the strongest clue in the entire episode. Sims. Throughout the series, Sims has always been presented as someone fiercely loyal to Bernard. Their relationship has never been based on friendship. It's built on trust, hierarchy, and shared knowledge. Sims doesn't simply follow orders, he understands why those orders exist. So when the story pushes the narrative that Bernard is gone, we have to ask whether Sims truly believed it himself. Look back at his behavior. Does he act like a man whose leader has disappeared forever? Or does he behave like someone carrying the burden of a secret he can't reveal? That's an important distinction. Fear and grief often make characters reckless in Silo, but secrecy makes them cautious. And Episode 4 shows Sims making calculated decisions rather than emotional ones. That isn't proof by itself, but when combined with Bernard's sudden reappearance, it opens the possibility that Sims wasn't protecting a lie about Bernard's death. He was protecting Bernard's survival. If that's true, it changes everything we've assumed about his actions. But here's where the theory becomes even more interesting. What if Bernard surviving wasn't the objective? What if disappearing were? Because those are two completely different ideas. Imagine you're Bernard. You understand that the rebellion has reached a point where every public move you make strengthens your enemies. People no longer fear you because they trust you. They fear you because they hate you. At that stage, remaining visible becomes a weakness. But if everyone believes you're gone, suddenly your enemies stop watching for your next move. They begin fighting each other instead. That would be classic Bernard. He's never been the strongest person in the room. He's always been the smartest. The possibility that Bernard intentionally allowed the illusion of his death isn't just dramatic. It's perfectly consistent with the way he has operated since the beginning of the series. Information has always been his greatest weapon. He controls archives, restricts history, manipulates narratives, and decides who learns the truth. Faking, or at least allowing the assumption of his death, would simply be another form of information control. And then Episode 4 quietly introduces another clue that may explain why he needed that illusion in the first place: the hidden space beneath the silo. On the surface, it looks like another mysterious location designed to expand the world. But what if it serves another purpose? Hidden infrastructure has always represented forgotten truths in Silo. Every secret tunnel, abandoned room, and buried machine tells the same story. Someone built more than people were meant to know. So when the episode draws attention to this concealed area, it isn't just adding another mystery. It creates the perfect environment for someone like Bernard to survive without being seen. Notice how carefully the show frames these discoveries. The underground structures don't feel abandoned in the ordinary sense. They feel preserved, almost waiting for someone who already knew they existed. And that raises a fascinating possibility. What if Bernard wasn't escaping to safety? What if he were returning to a place he had known about all along? That idea would explain something that has bothered fans ever since the supposed explosion. Bernard never seemed like the type of leader who would build his entire strategy around a single room with no contingency plan. This is the man who spent years protecting the silo's deepest secrets. Are we really supposed to believe he never prepared for the possibility that everything could collapse around him? It doesn't fit his character. In fact, it contradicts nearly everything we've learned about him. Bernard has always believed that survival belongs to the people who prepare for outcomes no one else expects. If anyone inside Silo 18 had hidden routes, emergency protocols, or knowledge of forgotten structures beneath the city, it would almost certainly be him. And that's where the theory begins to shift. Maybe episode 4 isn't asking us to figure out how Bernard survived. Maybe it's challenging us to realize that Bernard never intended to die in the first place. If Bernard truly planned for this moment, then his survival wasn't luck. It was preparation. And once you start looking at episode 4 through that lens, several scenes begin to connect in ways that aren't obvious on a first watch. The writers never come out and tell us the answer, but they leave behind enough breadcrumbs to build a theory that's difficult to ignore. More importantly, this theory doesn't rely on wild speculation. It relies on Bernard's own personality. Because one thing this show has established over and over again is that Bernard never plays a game unless he's already thinking about how it ends. The third piece of evidence isn't something Bernard says. It's something the show refuses to explain. Think about every major death in Silo. When a character truly reaches the end of their story, the audience is given closure. The camera lingers. Other characters react. The emotional weight is undeniable, because the writers want you to accept that person's fate before moving on. But Bernard's disappearance never carried that same sense of finality. Instead, it left behind unanswered questions. Questions about timing. Questions about where he actually was. Questions about what happened immediately after the chaos unfolded. Those missing moments are important because television writers don't usually skip over the most critical part of a major character's death, unless they intend to revisit it later. In hindsight, episode 4 feels less like a shocking resurrection, and more like the payoff to a mystery that quietly began the moment Bernard vanished. Now ask yourself another question. If Bernard had actually died, who benefits? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Juliette gains an opportunity to fight back. The rebellion gains hope. The people finally believe the system can fall. But when you think about it, Bernard's death also creates something incredibly dangerous: a leadership vacuum. And power vacuums almost always lead to confusion. Different factions begin making decisions without coordination. Rumors replace facts. Fear replaces strategy. For someone like Bernard, who understands that information is the most powerful weapon in the silo, chaos could actually become an advantage. While everyone argues over what happens next, the one man everyone stopped looking for is suddenly free to observe the board from the shadows. That's exactly why I think Bernard's disappearance may have been more valuable than his presence, because sometimes the best place to control the game is from outside the spotlight. That brings us to the fourth piece of evidence, and it's hiding beneath our feet. Episode 4 spends an unusual amount of time introducing the forgotten spaces beneath the silo. At first, they seem like another piece of world building, a mysterious location, an abandoned engineering project, another reminder that the founders built far more than anyone living inside the silo understands. But what if the location itself isn't the revelation? What if it's proof that Bernard always had somewhere to go? Remember, Bernard has spent years protecting classified information that ordinary citizens were never allowed to access. He knew about restricted archives. He knew about hidden technology. He knew the truth behind generations of carefully managed lies. So is it really a stretch to believe he also knew about forgotten maintenance routes, sealed corridors, or emergency systems buried beneath the silo? In fact, I'd argue it would be stranger if he didn't. If anyone possessed a complete map of the silo's hidden infrastructure, it would be the person trusted with preserving its greatest secrets. And here's the detail that really caught my attention. The underground spaces don't feel random. They feel intentional. They're too organized, too engineered, too significant to exist without serving a larger purpose. The founders didn't build one of humanity's most sophisticated survival systems while forgetting to include contingency plans. Every critical system has backups. Every secure facility has emergency procedures. Every government bunker has escape protocols for key personnel. If the silos truly represent humanity's final attempt at survival, then the people who designed them almost certainly anticipated catastrophic failures. Fires, structural collapses, political uprisings, even attacks from within. That means hidden routes wouldn't be unusual, they'd be expected. And if those routes exist, Bernard would almost certainly know where they are. Now let's connect that idea to something we've seen throughout the series. Bernard has always behaved like a man carrying knowledge that nobody else possesses. Sometimes he makes decisions that seem irrational until several episodes later, when the audience finally learns what he already knew. The writers have used that storytelling pattern again and again. They deliberately place viewers one step behind Bernard's understanding of the world. So when episode 4 suddenly reveals that he's alive, it fits that same pattern perfectly. We aren't discovering something Bernard learned recently. We're discovering something Bernard planned long before anyone else realized they should even be asking the question. But here's where the theory becomes even more unsettling. What if Bernard's survival isn't actually the biggest twist? What if the biggest twist is that someone else helped him? Because surviving an event like that isn't just about finding a way out. It's about timing. It's about access. It's about knowing exactly when to move and exactly where to go. That kind of precision suggests preparation. And preparation often requires allies. We know there are people inside the silo who understand more than they're willing to admit. We know information is compartmentalized. We know secrets are traded carefully between those trusted to keep the system running. So it's entirely possible Bernard didn't survive because he was lucky. He survived because parts of the system were designed to protect people like him when everything else failed.